I am very happy to welcome all of you to the 38th Annual HCIL Symposium 2021. My name is Niklas Elmqvist. I'm the director of the HCIL here at University of Maryland, College Park, and I'm a professor in the iSchool at the College of Information Studies. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our second edition of an online symposium. Normally, for the first 36 times the symposium was run, we were live in person. Obviously, that changed last year. Last year was the first time online. This year, we are old hands at this. This is the second time. And the benefit of all this, of course, being online is that we can open ourselves to a much larger audience. To help me open the symposium, well, actually, before I go any further, let me just point out a few things about the symposium today. First of all, closed captioning is available, and you just have to turn on the setting on your side to get a live transcript of this. All of the sessions today, the plenary session this morning, as well as all of the afternoon sessions, will be live captioned, thanks to a gracious donation by Kate and Gregg Vanderheiden. I also want to encourage all of you to make this event even more global than it is. Feel free to tweet about things that you see using the hashtags HCIL and HCIL 2021. Help spread the word. Tell everyone about all of the cool work that you see here today. To help me open the symposium, I'm going to hand over the floor to Dr. Keith Marzullo, who is the Dean of the College of Information Studies here at University of Maryland. He's my dean, in other words, and one of the sort of three benefactors of the iSchool, of the HCIL, the iSchool, the Department of Computer Science, and UMIAX. Keith.
Thank you, Niklas. I'm honored and delighted to welcome you to the 2021 HCI Symposium. As Niklas said, because of the pandemic, the symposium is virtual, which is both a shame and something wonderful. It's a shame because HCI researchers care about people. That's the H in HCI, of course. And as a group, we do like to schmooze. By being virtual, we have a tremendous reach. We have registered attendees from 61 US universities, ranging alphabetically, from Carnegie Mellon University to Wayne State University. We also have registered attendees from 62 international universities, ranging from Aligarh Muslim University in India to Zhejiang University in China. We have attendees from agencies, from companies, CEOs, consultants, and of course, importantly, students. So welcome to you all. Many of you may not know what an iSchool is or why we care about HCI. The I stands for information. Not every university has an iSchool, but there's over 100 iSchools worldwide, and the number is going up, especially in Asia. My college is quite interdisciplinary, with faculty holding advanced degrees in anthropology, American studies, biomedical and math informatics, information science, information systems, cognitive psychology, communications, computer science, education, electrical engineering, English, library science, organizational psychology, and social psychology, just to name a few. We care about democratizing access to information, the decisions that is made with that information. We care about protecting people against information overload, as well as protecting people's privacy and security. We are drawn to problems that help people who need help. Indeed, we are drawn to areas of market failure. You can see why we're interested in HCI. It's all about the intersection of information technology and people, which is where we live and where HCI lives. Many of our faculty are members in HCIL. I'm one of them. And we offer courses in HCI, UX design, and accessibility. The next set of talks, so plenary talks, contains several by iSchool faculty. And listening to them, you'll get a bit of the flavor of what we do in research in the iSchool. So we are proud supporters of the HCI Lab and the HCI Symposium. I'm delighted again that I was asked to introduce this, and welcome to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. To just give a picture of the breadth of all of the attendees for today's events, we have more than 700 registered attendees that will be popping in and out of talks during the day. And you can see a picture here of some of the global breadth. There's also a wide variety of backgrounds and interests among the participants, as well as the topics that these people are interested in. So there's really a good cross-section of human-computer interaction research represented in both the talks that you'll see today, as well as and in the attendees. So over the day, starting from this morning's plenary session, going all the way until 12 p.m., we have plenary talks where select faculty from the HCIL will talk about research and big picture ideas. At 12 to 1, we have a lunch break, but during this time, we will have historical Chi videos presented by Catherine Pleisante and Ben Schneiderman. So please hang on and stay in the session to listen and hear about these things while you're having your lunch. In the afternoon, we're going to pose you with an interesting dilemma because you have to choose between parallel sessions. There's 2 different tracks from 1 to 2:15 and then from 2:30 to 4 p.m. during which we have several different rooms. Please refer to your schedule and the Eventbrite invitations to figure out where and which session you can go to. And you can absolutely jump between sessions if there are talks that you want to catch in parallel ones. At 4 to 6, we're going to have a virtual happy hour in Kumo space. There's information about how to join this later on too, which is a little more informal and would give some opportunities for discussions and networking. This year, just like last year, we have switched from, instead of having academic papers, instead having popular science blog posts. And these are all presented at the Medium publication for the HCIL, which is called Sparks of Innovation, Stories from the HCIL. And you can find the link right there. It's also linked to each of the individual talks that are given today. So follow those to read more. These blog posts are supposed to be approachable and written in lay people terms so that they are more accessible to a wider audience. Some of the talks that you'll see today, by the nature of the symposium, will not have a blog post because they are in progress work. Maybe they're under review, or there's very early type of research. And the purpose here is just to give you all the privilege of seeing these things talked about, but not in writing yet. This year, we also have added a Discord server to go along with the presentations today, allowing everyone a chance to ask questions and discuss topics that you see during the talks in an asynchronous fashion instead of we provide an out-of-band communication channel. And this is also how we will be sourcing questions during the different talks. So to join this, you just follow this link at the bottom, ter.ps/discord, and it will allow you to get started with the server. And you're going to be presented with a view that looks a little like what you see on the left side here. You will note that there are different sessions, the different text channels for discussing each of the plenaries, each of the sessions during the day. And there's also voice channels that we will be using during the breaks. If you want to have some simulation of what would happen in a normal physical symposium, going out and just talking to people. As always, I want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors for making not just the symposium, but all of the activities in the HCIL possible over the last year. This year, in particular, we want to recognize Google as well as Bank of America for their significant contributions. In addition, the University of Maryland campus came together and provided sponsorship, including the Department of Computer Science, the College of Information Studies, the Applied Research Laboratory for Intelligence and Security, ARLIS, and the University of Maryland Institute for Advanced Computer Studies, UMIAX, and then finally, the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. Thank you. Over the year, of course, our faculty, staff, and students have been funded in many different capacities, but various funding agencies and companies, and these are listed here. Over the last year, the HCIL staff, faculty, and students also have amassed a lot of different accomplishments that I want to recognize in particular today. First of all, as always, our family of HCIL staff, students, and faculty is growing, I want to recognize two new HCIL faculty members, Ji-Cheng Liu, who joined us last summer with computer science, and Pablo Paredes, who's joining computer science from Stanford University. Welcome to the HCIL. I also want to thank, as always, our amazing coordinator, Beth Domingo, for coordinating and planning not just the symposium, which was a Herculean task, but also the entire HCIL and its activities over this past year, especially given all of the challenges that we've been facing. I want to congratulate Catherine Pleisante for receiving the IEEE VGTC 2020 Visualization Career Award, which is the highest award that can be given to a visualization professional for their professional career, as well as her induction into the IEEE Visualization Academy. I want to congratulate Leilani Battle, who was appointed on MIT Technology Review 35 Innovators Under 35, the TR35 list in summer of 2020. And I want to congratulate Jonathan Lazar for being inducted into ACM SIG Chi Academy in 2021 and receiving the SIG Access Award 2020, that should be 2020, not 21, for outstanding contributions to computing and accessibility. Congratulations, all of you. For the last 2 years, we have been awarding two very special awards to students, both for the HCIL as well as our sister graduate program or master's program called the HCIM. The HCIL version of this is called the HCIL Maryland Way Award. Both of these were given by Jenny Priest and Ben Schneiderman, who of course are central and legendary figures in the HCIL's history, which will be given to, over the last, over 5 years in total, to 2 HCIL graduate students. So for the HCIL research side, in other words, this is cross-disciplinary, across campus, graduate students who have exhibited the Maryland Way. I first want to recognize the runner-up for this award, Alicia Pradhan, who is a runner-up for the HCIL Maryland Way Award in 2021. And then I'm happy to announce the 2 winners. First winner, in no particular order here, is Emma Dixon for embodying the Maryland Way with her research, camaraderie, and lab spirit. Congratulations, Emma. And the second winner is Jonggi Hong for embodying the Maryland Way with his research, camaraderie, and lab spirit. Congratulations. Okay, so these are all good news. I also have some bittersweet news to share. Okay, actually, let me continue first with the HCIM Excellence Award. Apologies for that. So still some good news. I will recognize the 2 master's students who have received the Counterpart Award for their excellence in the HCIM program, also awarded by Jenny Priest and Ben Schneiderman. The first winner for the HCIM Excellence Award is Amy Asadi for her tireless work with the HCIM committee and her work to improve the HCIM community. Congratulations, Amy. And the second winner, again, in no particular order, is Malcolm Moore for being a pillar of community support, engagement, and interest both within and without the classroom. Congratulations, Malcolm. All right, so now I think it's time for the slightly bittersweet news after all these great accomplishments. And that piece of news is that our very own Catherine Pleisante is retiring. And in recognition of this, I and a bunch of her colleagues across the world have assembled a little video salute for her retirement. So let me premiere this now.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine.
Hello, Catherine.
Hey, Catherine.
Catherine.
Hey, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine.
Bonjour, Catherine.
Hola, Catherine. Hello, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine.
Hello, Catherine.
I know you said you didn't want a big retirement announcement, but I just couldn't let that stand.
Congratulations on your retirement.
Congratulations.
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 Thank you, everyone.
Congratulations on your retirement.
Fantastically successful career. Thank you for being a great colleague.
Congratulations on your retirement, Catherine.
Congratulations on your retirement.
Best of luck on your retirement.
Félicitations, Catherine.
Félicitations.
No.
Félicitations on your upcoming retirement.
Félicitations pour votre retraite.
Bonne retraite, Catherine.
À bientôt en France.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
And thank you for all the great years of collaborations and fun. You deserve a formal party and a song.
Thanks for being a wonderful friend and colleague for more than 30 years.
And a terrific colleague and friend to me as well.
Thank you, and best of luck on your next adventures.
Thank you, and best wishes for your continuing adventure.
Best wishes for your next adventure.
Looking forward to lots more adventures with you.
Looking forward to great new adventures.
Catherine, may you slide into retirement and unlock a very happy place.
Let me just show you how this is done.
Your work has shaped the field and my own thoughts for decades.
Ça a été un grand plaisir de travailler avec toi toutes ces années. Au plaisir de célébrer ça à Interact, à Paris.
Very impactful and meaningful career that definitely changed my life as a researcher.
You've inspired us all with your work and your example.
Your work on the visualization of time-oriented data sparked my interest into the topic.
I'm so grateful for you from your big picture HCIL thinking, providing feedback to myself and my students on research, and conversations over tea and cookies.
It was an absolute honor working with you in the HCIL. You're an amazing researcher, gifted mentor, and one of the most thoughtful, giving people we've ever met.
Thank you for your hard work for the HCIL over the years. You are the heart and soul of our lab.
You know that you'll be missed.
I will miss our Wednesday walks to the farmers market.
I wish you a very happy retirement.
Just want to tell you good luck on your retirement.
And so now that you're retiring, I'm really looking forward to see you even more in France. Bye.
Cheers.
Well, thank you, everybody. This was a very wonderful surprise. Thank you. Now I can't see very well from laughing. Thank you.
You're very welcome. So,
Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine.
I will make that video available. Maybe you weren't able to see it as well on the stream. It's going to be available later for those of you who want to see it again. And of course, Catherine will get all the clips. I wasn't able to use all of the material that everyone sent. So she will get all of the complete clips as well from each of the individual who is able to send this in. Okay. So we're almost at the end here of my opening talk, remarks. I just want to encourage all of you to use the various communication channels given to you to ask questions. Students really appreciate the feedback. That's one of the big reasons we're doing all this. So please use the in-Zoom chat or use Discord to ask questions throughout the day. I also want to recognize all of the volunteers that have made this possible. This has been a significant effort and a team effort. So thank all of you for this. And then I am only going to hand it over to the next speaker in the plenary sessions and wish you all a happy symposium. Thank you for attending. Please enjoy today. So we have our very first speaker. I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to our very first speaker, who is Gregg Vanderheiden. Gregg, of course, is a faculty member in the Ecology of Information Studies and director of the Trace Center.
Thank you very much. I've been asked to talk about the Trace Center, and this is the 50th anniversary of the Trace Center. So I'm going to try to cover 50 years in 15 minutes. So we'll move along kind of quickly, but if you have questions or anything, we can always talk about these later. So the Trace Center began in 1971 when David Lehners tricked Gregg Vanderheiden into going to a local school to see if there was a way that a 12-year-old who couldn't speak or write, had cerebral palsy, could be given a means of communication. And together they formed a group of undergraduate student volunteers, which then grew. It swiftly grew to 21 different volunteer students from 9 different departments and 5 different schools. And the initial focus was just on providing one child, Lydell, with an independent means to write and to communicate. The problem was that whenever somebody wasn't looking at his board all the time, He had no way to communicate, no way to do homework, no way to participate in the class. And he only had a wooden board with letters wood burned into it. The first auto monitoring communication board was created out of military surplus parts by the students. Later, with special permission from the university chancellor to allow a student to be a principal investigator, the students developed with NSF funding portable user programmable aid and successfully transferred this into production with telesensory systems. Then the team continued on, and it took on the Trace Center moniker and expanded its work over the decades into augmentative communication, interface, computer access, and universal design. In the first decade, the focus was on augmentative communication, and this is actually a term that was coined by the Trace Center and later came to be the name of the field. The first portable user programmable communication aid was developed, as well as the first portable speech communication aid. Now I say portable with quotes on it because it was based on the Deck Talk at that time, which was meant to be plugged into the wall and drew 5 amps. We hooked it up with a battery. We redid all of the ROMs so that it would turn on, speak, and then turn back off again. It was attached to the back of a wheelchair and was used by a wheelchair-bound individual for his first speech communication aid, the portable. We also started compiling information on all of the augmentative communication and interface devices for people with disabilities. And we started an annual resource book series. If anybody's interested in sort of the history of any of these areas, we actually have every year a catalog of everything available internationally in these areas. Back then, there were about 15 companies making different adaptive devices and control switches. And it turned out that no 2 of them accidentally used the same connector. And so we, with a grant from the National Science Foundation, we developed a standard for interconnection between these aids and their interfaces. And that standard is still used today. We also created a national workshop series, a 3-day workshop series, and gave these all across the country. I think we gave about 30 of them over the years, really taking this brand new field and getting it off and launched. And then we began to work on computer access toward the end. In the 80s, the focus expanded to include computer access. We laid out the computer accessibility landscape with 2 articles in Byte in 1982. We also did the first device that could be used for communication, writing, and computer access. It was called the Trine. And then we launched another workshop series, this one on computer access. Here, we were looking to try to not only introduce how to provide access to computers, but introduce microcomputers really for the first time. So for a lot of people, they'd never seen them, they've heard about them, they didn't know how they could be used. And so we had to change first on how to use the microcomputer, what it was, and then how to provide access to it. In 1984, the first White House Summit on Computer Accessibility was held, and I, along with Larry Skadden, who was blind from the National Science Foundation, and Frank Bau, who was deaf from Hofstra University, made the case to industry for accessibility. And that led to a second White House conference in 1985, where we had developed the first computer accessibility guidelines. And then finally, we began developing software and accessibility guidelines first for the Information Technology Foundation. We created the first scorecard used internally by Apple for accessibility in the 1980s. Interestingly, at that time, I was engaged by Apple to come in and work with their developers, and I had the ability to go anywhere and see anybody and talk about anything in the corporation in order to try to get all of their products more accessible. Something that doesn't happen today. We also created the guidelines used internally by Microsoft and IBM in the 1980s, as well as many other companies. In the third decade, the 90s, we added the web. We saw the Trace Center techniques being built into Stephen Hawking's communication aids. 8 of the first 10 accessibility features in Microsoft Windows were licensed royalty-free from the Trace Center. The first consumer product accessibility guidelines were created. And this was the first time that epilepsy and seizure disorders, et cetera, made it into guidelines so that people were protected against seizure disorders. And we'll see more about that. in a bit. Also, web accessibility guidelines. The first ones were right after, in January 1995, right after the WWW2, I'm missing a W on there. And true to the times, you can see that it was done in text format, because in those days, the only universal document format was text documents. And so this was the first time that web guidelines came out. But over the next few years, 38 different guidelines came out. So we then created unified guidelines, because nobody knew which ones to follow, that brought together all of them. And the version 8 was used as the first working draft for WCAG 1, which came out in 1991. And Trace Center provided one of the co-chairs and 2 of the 3 editors for WCAG. We also did a lot of the research that went into these, including the color contrast and seizure disorders, in order to quantify them and so that they could be actually included in standards. We also began at this time, over this period, summative information. You saw the original books that we were publishing. Well, we then moved them into CDs so that everybody could have an electronic searchable version. We created hyper-able data and DOS-able data, so that we had both Mac and PC versions of the able data database for the first time available on everyone's computer who wanted it. And then we moved able data onto the web. The fourth decade, we look at really universal design. We're looking at design of augmentative communication, interface, computer, web. We're one of the co-authors of the Universal Design Principles, and particularly making sure that they covered and applied well to ICT. We did the first public kiosk with built-in accessibility in 1999 in the Mall of America, and the first cross-disability voting prototypes in 1999. We were also asked to exhibit in the Grand Foyer at the White House in 1999, a very interesting experience. Sometime I can tell stories about this. And there was also a turning point about this time. The opening keynote at CHI 2001 was with Bill Gates, but I was asked to do the closing keynote about accessibility and about how this was something that applied to everyone. And the whole conference began to focus and was focused on basically everyone, anywhere access. So that for the first time, instead of the accessibility being a little small part, the idea of making ICT so that everyone could use it was starting to go mainstream. That year, we were also asked to co-design the National Library Services digital talking book player as they moved from tape recorders into a digital format. And we began seeing the work that we had done on cross-disability accessible public systems. So we see this now built into Amtrak machines. This is the automated postal systems at the US post offices across the country. This is an airport kiosk, security kiosks that you see at the airport. The kiosk accessibility work was featured in a Smithsonian exhibit. And we had developed now the Trace photosensitive epilepsy tool. This is actually an example of it analyzing the video clip of Pokemon. In Japan, they showed this cartoon on television and sent 350 children to the hospital. They then decided to show it on the evening news, and they sent another 350 kids to the hospital. So a lot of attention to being able to make sure that when we create things that are flashy and entertaining, that they can be accessible. However, the only tool for assessing it cost $30,000. So we developed an open source version, licensed an engine, and made it so that it was available free, so people could analyze their web content and videos. We also created a 3-part international standard on remote and alternative interfaces and intelligent agents, and WCAG 2.0 also came in this section, and we provided the co-chair and 2 of the 4 editors for those guidelines. You'll now find trace-based research in all of the different accessibility standards used internationally. In the 5th decade, which was the 2010s, we got together with a consortium of people from around the world to try to build what we call the global public inclusive infrastructure. And one of the things we came out of this was auto-personalization. Another one was we created a unified listing that brought together 12 databases from all over the world around ICT and made it so that in one place you could search and access all of the information from all of the databases. We also developed something called the developer space, and the developer space is available to allow people to find information who want to create accessible materials, but don't know where to find guidelines, techniques, strategies, etc. And in there is a very valuable master list of accessibility strategies, which I recommend to anybody interested in exploring the area. We also worked on simple and ultra simple interfaces and the first auto personalization of computers. The first installation on demand, AT Anywhere, the ability for someone to sit down to any computer at a library, a university, whatever, and have the assistive technologies they need show up instantly on that machine. And then when they get up and leave, go away. And also the first cross-platform simplification of the built-in features in these products. Now, we are now heading into Trace Center's 6th decade. And some of the areas that Trace will be exploring going forward include aging and dementia. And many of these you'll see throughout the conference today. Advancing cognitive accessibility, inclusive AI, teachable interfaces, AI and privacy, cross-disability and multidisciplinary access techniques. We have lots of techniques for single disabilities, but people don't just get one disability. Often they will have multiple, and the strategies need to be able to accommodate this. A one size fits one design principle. Instead of thinking about universal design being what interface can everybody use, which doesn't exist, how do we make interfaces so that they will automatically personalize to each individual to fit their needs? Fully open source tools, we have photosensitive epilepsy tool and others that we're trying to get all of them into full open source capability. Better tools for content creators, software developers, and managers. Research that supports data-based accessibility policy. Ubiquitous accessibility in AT. That is the ability for accessibility in AT to be everywhere that you go so that you don't have to be using special devices or only work in special places. And probably our biggest lift is going to be a complete rethinking of next generation ICT, completely rethinking how we go about doing it from policy to implementation. Our current strategies are failing, particularly around cognitive, but in all of the areas. And with the new technologies and new interface technologies, it's going to be even worse. And this is the team that's going to make it happen. So this is the core researchers at the Trace Center, Amanda Lazar, Hernisa Kacorri, Bern Jordan, Jonathan Lazar, no relation to Amanda Lazar, and Gregg Vanderheiden. And there's another whole, again, as many associate faculty and 5 times as many students, et cetera, who are all affiliated that are making all of this happen. And finally, I'd want to acknowledge quickly just some of the many funding agencies that have helped to make this possible. So thank you. It's been a great 50 years, and we are now heading into our second half decade of contribution to the field. Thank you.
So we have time for just 1 or 2 questions. If there are any, remember that you can use the Discord channel. I believe you can type in the chat too if you're an attendee for any questions. I would applaud Gregg for this amazing body of work. And I remember you spoke at a couple of years ago at the symposium, and you talked about your moonshot idea. So it looks like you have many moonshots now lined up. But what do you think? You know, what do you think of your? What's the status of this moonshot, and what's the big thing that you would see in the next 50 years?
Well, 2 separate questions. And the thing I see for the next 50 years is all the research of all of the other investigators. As I come to the end and they're at the beginning, it's a whole new era in the Trace Center, and it's going in many additional directions in a much fuller range than it's been possible to do in the past. And this is fantastic. And one of the reasons why we moved the Trace Center from Wisconsin to the University of Maryland. With regard to the other shot, that was the Morphic project, and you can see more about it at morphic.org, and that's now just been released. It's an open source accessibility for Windows and Macintosh. And it is, as I said, this month it's reached its full release. The thing that we have discovered there is that there are people who just have trouble using technology, and not because they're of an IQ or anything like this. We know people that are blazingly brighter than we are who can't use it. But we'll be talking more about that at the last presentation of the HCIL, so I won't take the time now to talk further about it here.
Let me ask another question from the audience. So Karen asks, if you were an incoming freshman, what area would you be most excited to study?
Interface, human interface, to me, the focus of HCIL. We are reinventing the entire world, and it's going to be a really interesting one because we think of interface as the device, and the interface is something a device has. But over the next decades, we're going to see the interface be something that is a melding of the human and the machine together. And so everything we think about interface is going to change. But everything that people can do is also going to be mediated by this. And so it's going to be an amazing area to do, and probably one of the most fascinating, and require more backgrounds in more areas than we've ever seen. So it'll be a blossoming of interdisciplinary, because there won't be any other way of doing it.
Great, thank you, Greg. I know there's a few more questions. I'm, in the interest of time, going to let Greg and other TRACE faculty answer them in the Discord or the Zoom chat. So thank you, Greg, for your talk.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
All right, so our next speaker is Dr. Yoel Chan. Yoel is a faculty member in the iSchool here at University of Maryland. So take it away, Yoel.
Thanks, Niklas. Yeah, I'm excited to share the work I've been doing with collaborators here on designing a new medium for sustainable knowledge synthesis. So let me jump right in. The goal of this research is to remove barriers to effective synthesis so any scientist can ask better questions faster. What do I mean by synthesis? Let me give you an example. This is Esther Duflo, and she won a Nobel Prize, and she credited a synthesis for this. She talked about in a 2011 article about how during her PhD, she was handed a masterful survey of the literature. It was a handbook of developmental economics that really opened up the whole field for her and identified all the open problems that she could work on. Really, really instrumental to her being able to formulate the right questions and really tackle the work that led to a Nobel Prize. Very, very important aspect of knowledge progress, synthesis. Unfortunately, synthesis is actually really hard. So if you ever try to do a lit review, you probably identify with this picture of needing to scale a mountain of papers that grows taller and taller and taller. To stand on the shoulders of giants, you must first climb up their backs. The greater the body of knowledge, the harder this climb becomes. And you may actually identify even more with this picture of being overwhelmed and swept away by a full tide of papers from one field, let alone many. What do we do about this? First thing that we've been doing is trying to diagnose what's the problem here. And we've been really enamored with this idea of our scholarly communication infrastructure really operating on the wrong unit of analysis. So if you think about what you're actually trying to do when you do a lit review, you actually don't care about papers. You care about ideas, claims, arguments, theories, findings, and discourse relations between them. What supports something, what opposes something, replications, contradictions. Instead, what we get is we don't get theories and evidence as first-class citizens, but if you go to any search engine for scholarly communication, what you get is mostly a focus on papers. It's all about sorting papers, organizing papers, retrieving papers. You put in a query for actually a finding about what's the effect of bans on hate speech, for example, and you get a bunch of papers back that you then have to sift through to find the ones that actually have findings, and then extract those findings, and then get to your synthesis, and then ask the questions that you want. All this extra work is really going to waste right now. It's really significant overhead for scientific progress. So our work is building on a couple decades of work developing this idea of discourse graphs. So we're going to call it discourse graphs to evoke this idea of basically networks of not papers, but claims and evidence. So for example, imagine if we could leverage a structure like this, that instead of a database of papers, we also have a database of claims, like banning as a strategy cannot scale to meet demands of moderation, and that's supported by a bunch of different evidences. And that's in opposition to a different claim that banning is effective response to bad actors that's supported by its own set of evidence. And you can start to synthesize where the open problems are based on a grounding in the evidence and also the structure of the discourse. This is an exciting concept that has spawned a lot of work on technical standards and infrastructures that's quite mature right now. You can think about this as the warehouses being built for discourse graphs. The problem is they're mostly empty right now. So lots of very sad technical developers have built these warehouses expecting an ocean of nano publications. At the moment, there's no more than a puddle. It's very, very hard to motivate contributions that's separate from the regular infrastructure of papers. We can think about this as an authorship bottleneck. People have tried specialized curator models where they get crowd workers or volunteers or pay scientists to do extra work to contribute discourse graphs. This is very accurate, but very expensive to sustain. On the flip side, there's excitement about maybe text mining alone because it's relatively cheap, but there's been very significant accuracy and transparency challenges converting the unstructured text of papers into more structured discourse graphs, dealing with the messiness of evolving knowledge. It's not clear to me that this is actually ever going to go away, no matter how good we get with NLP. But I'm not going to sit around and wait for this. So we're exploring a alternative complementary concept that we're calling scholar-powered contributions. And the key insight here is that if you think about it, actually, we are already doing a lot of the work that's required for discourse graphs. You read papers and you extract claims, evidence, and think about the relationships between them. You write notes about them. You talk about this in your papers, in your lit review section. So a lot of this work is already being done. How can we integrate tools and authoring interfaces into individual collaborative synthesis practices to start to contribute as a natural byproduct of people doing their usual practices of synthesis? Is that possible? The basic idea that we think is possible is that if we have a way for people to build their own personal discourse graphs for themselves to make their synthesis better instead of a separate task for someone else that they don't know, and make it easy for them to share this discourse graph with other people, then anytime people start a new project, instead of only drawing on databases of papers, they can also draw on discourse graphs, significantly cutting down the overhead to synthesis. And over time, as we have enough of these discourse graphs maintained, we can start to aggregate these into decentralized commons of discourse graphs. We'll return to this last point very briefly at the end of this talk. But for now, we're going to focus on the first three steps, this arc of how do we get people to create a discourse graph for themselves? What is that going to look like? And what might it look like for it to be in a form that can be shared with other people? So we're going to talk about, I'm going to share a proof of concept with you today of how that might work. So we'll take you through a user journey of creating your own discourse graph. So it starts with a very familiar place. You have a question that you want to do a synthesis on, like how susceptible are young children to COVID-19 infection given equivalent exposure? You start with a bunch of sources, as usual. You have a pile of papers you have to read. You make your way through them, reading, annotating sources. And then in step 3, we start to do something a little bit different. So instead of summarizing each individual paper, which is a paper-centric model, we respect the one-to-many relationship between sources and evidence and create separate documents for every single result of interest from the sources. And it doesn't have to be super structured, right? So you can just write in plain text what the main result is. Maybe here, this paper actually says, if you model Wuhan case data, and you use a parameter that has susceptibility vary by age, you estimate actually children are about 2 times lower in terms of susceptibility compared to adults. You can write a summary in the body of the document of the details. You can put in various grounding contexts, like where's the code for the data, what kind of model they used, and so on. Not too different from what you might write in your own notes. The key difference here is we are respecting this one-to-many relationship between sources and evidence. So each of these evidence becomes their own document instead of being tied specifically to a source. If we do that, we can then synthesize these evidence note into an argument or outline in a way that doesn't look so different again from writing an outline or drafting an argument for a paper. So you can imagine this looking quite similar to a lit review section in a paper, right? So we have a question here. This is a document that's addressing this question. And you can see here, these look like citations, right? These are like hyperlinks. The key difference here is that instead of citing papers, we can now cite evidence in a much more granular way. So each of these citations actually points to a specific evidence note. This compresses a great deal of information into a form that you can synthesize much more easily. Once you do that, you can start to think carefully about what kinds of claims are emerging from this evidence. On the one hand, maybe children are equally susceptible. On the other hand, maybe children are approximately half as likely to contract COVID. And you can start to tie these very closely to the evidence and reason in much more detail about what's going on. Once you have this structure, actually, there's actually a great deal of implicit discourse structure that we can parse to turn it into a discourse graph if you have these entities. If you have questions, if you have claims, if you have evidence, each of these are separate documents. And we use basic conventions like an outline where we indent things that are related to each other. For instance, you could say, here's one claim that they're half as likely. Here's the case for this claim. And then what follows is you drop in different pieces of evidence that supports this claim. There's a discourse relation of evidence supporting claims. Also, the evidence is sitting inside this question note. And so this evidence informs this question. And we can start to parse out this structure into a formal discourse graph that's actually explicit in terms of the entities and relationships between them, turning immediately useful notes with implicit discourse structure into a reusable, shareable, explicit discourse graph. If we have this, we can profit. We can start to reap the benefits of having a discourse graph. So on the right here, you can see this is a proof of concept of actually a real graph query. A formal graph database query that allows us to ask questions like, find any evidence that informs a particular question and get a bunch of evidence notes back. Instead of grabbing a bunch of papers you have to sift through, now you can get straight to the evidence to inform your question instead of a pile of papers. All kinds of other graph queries are now possible as well with this kind of simple structure of questions, claims, evidence, and discourse relations. You can find evidence that supports or opposes a claim. You can compare support and opposition for a claim, cluster by evidence strength if you add it to evidence notes, and so on and so forth. A brief word about how this works, right? So there are 3 key ingredients, just to give you a sense of how simple this is actually. So you have a simple convention for note writing that's not so different from what people normally do in terms of thinking about questions, claims, and evidence and relationships between those. We've done groundwork actually identifying that people actually already do something like this. We have that note writing happen in a hypertext notebook, which allows us to interlink these individual notes into a structure. The proof of concept I showed you is implemented in a software called Rome Research, but there's all kinds of new hypertext notebooks, including more popular ones like Notion, which you may have heard of, that are capable of doing hypertext, basically linking text to each other. And most of these hypertext notebooks have capabilities for extension, so we can extend with plugins to parse the conventions into a formal discourse graph. Not too complicated. So those are the 3 simple ingredients. So to recap, we have a proof of concept that it is possible to write close to prose and actually create a shareable discourse graph as a byproduct if you have simple conventions for note writing, hypertext notebook, and plugins to parse notes in a discourse graph. This opens up new paths to sustainable, scholar-powered authoring of synthesis-friendly infrastructures. So a quick word about how we'll scale. So this is, if you've been paying attention, this looks very kind of small scale, individuals and collaborators, and that's actually great. If we just stop there, that would be a huge win. But to kind of think about scaling up, we want to prioritize decentralization, federation over centralization, uniform single source of truth to respect the contextual and contentious nature of knowledge production. All right, so with that, I'll just leave up a quick scan of the summary here and thank my core team and collaborators and funders, and look forward to actually talking to you in Discord since I'm at time. Thank you.
We have time for maybe one short question before we move on. And I've been trying to monitor the chat here. One question I think I would ask is, so all this work for conceptualizing, but in the end, you're creating a paper. You're creating a linear paper. So how do you, how do you see this work that you're doing also changing the future of what an academic paper looks like? So that it's not just a linear sequence of text that you read from start to finish.
I'm very glad you asked that question, right? So people actually talked in one of the paths that I didn't talk about is people talking about changing the scholarly communication infrastructure by changing what we write instead of papers into this. And I want to say this actually could help with that, right? So people get normalized and understand, oh, we have these micro publications. What if instead of doing this work on the back end, after we have papers, we do it from the front end, and maybe we submit with our papers various micro publications, or we do away with papers altogether and have a infrastructure of micro publications. That's exciting work. That's not what I'm doing, but I'm really, really hopeful to support that as well. I think it's a viable path. We hope that will be the future of scholarly communication.
Excellent. Thank you, Joel. In interest of time, we're going to move on, but please take discussions and questions to Discord. There's always already a healthy discussion where a lot of the speakers are chiming in on questions that came up and weren't answered in the session itself. So please go to Discord. The Zoom chat, we are trying to copy the questions over because the Zoom chat disappears. It's not as dynamic, so it disappears once the session ends. That's why we're trying to put most of the discussions in Discord. This can actually continue way after the symposium. All right, let me move on to our next speaker. It's Dr. Jason Farman, who's a professor of American Studies here at University of Maryland.
All right, thank you so much. Really excited to be with all of you today and looking forward to the day. So my name is Jason Farman. I'm a professor and director of the Design, Cultures, and Creativity program in American Studies. And the title of my talk today is Creative Misuse, Tactics for Innovation at the Edges of the Familiar. And the premise of my talk today is that the world around us wasn't simply invented. It was instead rearranged through acts of misuse. So innovation is not about creating something wholly inventive, but it's about finding the unexpected combinations that ultimately can change how we see everyday objects. By reconfiguring that which already exists, by putting odd pieces together that were never intended to fit with each other, designers and users alike are able to imagine new worlds and new ways of doing things. So creative misuse is not about using technologies as they're given to us. It instead asks us to use technology in unexpected ways that allows users to see alternative ways of living and interacting with our technologies. Creative practice with technology is a really key way that we're able to see the new potential and how we can use technologies in the future. So misuse typically carries negative connotations with it, but it's by breaking things that we can actually truly see how they work. By misusing that which already exists, we can see the guts of the technologies, we can see the assumptions of designers, and we can recombine these into unforeseen combinations that can ultimately potentially get us to design the world better. But this is extremely difficult to do. And why? Why is it so difficult to imagine and sort of move beyond the familiar when it comes to design? And I want to answer that question with my origin story, or how I fell in love with creative misuse. So I have a long history with creative misuse that actually begins back in elementary school. So I was a latchkey kid in the 1980s in Southern California, and I would walk home after school, drop my backpack off at my empty house, and I'd pick up my skateboard and I'd begin my search. So I was in 5th grade at the time, and my neighborhood east of Los Angeles was in a deep drought along with the entire state. of California. And on early release days when school would let out around lunchtime, there was this exciting quiet to my neighborhood, and my skateboard wheels would rattle through the alleyways as I'd peer over backyard fences in search of empty swimming pools to use as makeshift skate parks. So due to the drought, pools all across the state of California were empty, waiting to be misused by latchkey kids in this new sport. Hopping over backyard fences and sliding my wheels over the blue surfaces of empty pools seemed more like rebellion than it did creativity. It was maybe more vandalism than it was innovation. But for me, this moment would ultimately carry over into the ways that I would define creativity as a practice of finding new ways for using familiar objects. Something like a swimming pool is designed with a very particular set of practices that are predetermined. So you can swim, you can dive, splash, or float. You might do a school science experiment about pool chemicals, but if you were asked to imagine a new use for this familiar object, it's extraordinarily difficult to think beyond the obvious. That is until the cultural and environmental shifts present a kid being raised by a single mom with an empty pool and a new interest in an activity like skateboarding. So you bring these forces together at the same time, and young people all over the world began seeing this new use as a possible pathway, to the frustration of homeowners who would come home early and catch me in their backyards, and I'd have to scramble over the fence as quickly as possible. So this, for me, demonstrates what's at stake for creative misuse as a method for design. In our technological moment, designers are asked to innovate and imagine new futures. What's produced is often a familiar set of practices. Designers and creative practitioners have tremendous difficulty thinking beyond that which already exists. We're all sitting around splashing in the pool when we need to empty it completely. So this is exacerbated by the fact that we're surrounded by an inescapable narrative about technology, that we're moving forward along a predestined journey where our devices and technologies will continue to get faster, smaller, more efficient, and make our lives better. This predetermined journey veils, though, the process of actually creating that future. It takes it for granted as if we don't have to design it. But how do we design and create for a future if we can't understand how to move beyond the familiar uses of existing technologies? So for me, creative misuse is a practice for bringing together existing objects and behaviors in unexpected pairings that produce new ways of seeing the world. It doesn't require us to invent our futures whole cloth. Instead, we're combining different elements from wildly different spheres of our lives and our work to defamiliarize the things that we take for granted. As designers, as we work to create a better world, creative misuse offers one key piece of advice: don't dismantle the world, just rearrange it. So I want to give you a few examples of creative misuse as they're in practice at the moment. The first is the use of undersea internet cables for seismic detection of tectonic plates. So scientists at Caltech and other universities are using the internet cables that we are actually connecting on right now around the world as a way of measuring tectonic plates and movements at a nanoscale on the ocean floor. They're taking the fibers of fiber optic cables, and there are slight errors in them where they produce an instrument that can send laser pulses down the cable and collect and measure the echo of each pulse as it's reflected off of the internal flaws of the fiber optic cable. So this is ultimately a way of taking something that goes back to the telegraph, these cables that sit on the ocean floor, and then ultimately used for internet connection, and misusing them, using them in a way that goes well beyond their initial intention, and finding ways of using them in unexpected ways. Another example I draw on is what are called desire lines, where in urban design you have sidewalks, but then next to sidewalks or off pathways, you have people cutting their own paths through what are supposed to be green spaces, and these are called desire lines. And universities, for example, like here at the University of Maryland, this is McKeldin Mall. The legend goes that before the planners laid down the concrete, they actually waited to see where the desire lines would emerge. See where people are journeying before you actually laid down the sidewalks there. And so by seeing how people misuse the space, misuse urban design, you can imagine where they're moving and why people are moving in the ways that they are, and paying attention to that. A parallel concept is the emergence of the hashtag on Twitter. When Twitter was launched in 2007, hashtags were not a part of the initial interface. But users decided that they needed a way to organize around concepts and data. So they suggested introducing the hashtag as a way of collaborating and finding each other and organizing information on the platform. Twitter looked at that and said, this is a fantastic idea, and incorporated it into their designs and into the way that the interface worked. So this was something that was not a part of the design. It was a misuse by users that ultimately then became a core feature of the platform. Another example of people paying attention to how users are misusing their product came with the invention of bubble wrap in the 1950s. The bubble wrap was actually invented as wallpaper initially. It was designed to be this modernist aesthetic wallpaper for a beat generation. It obviously didn't take off, but around the same time in the late 1950s, IBM was beginning to ship internationally their 1401 system. And they began seeing this wallpaper as actually a great use of protecting sensitive computer equipment. And as shipments of computer technologies around the globe began to increase right around this time, the company completely pivoted, and now we have the Sealed Air company that is using bubble wrap instead of as wallpaper as protection for shipments. For the book that I'm writing, I'm also doing some research on the use of distortion in microphones and guitars and the emergence of it. This distortion and feedback is actually a glitch within the system. It's not, it's an error. It's not meant to be a part of it. But what's interesting for me is the question, when did this glitch, this mistake, become a feature? When did it become something that was incorporated into the aesthetics of music? And you begin to see this in Black blues musicians in America, through blues guitarists in the 1950s, who were the first to use feedback in their music, all the way then the culmination of that in Jimi Hendrix's final day of Woodstock, Star Spangled Banner use of feedback. So taking this glitch and using it as a musical expression. And it culminates around these contexts of racial tension, civil rights in the United States, as well as frustration around the Vietnam War, where feedback and distortion become an expression that far extends the human voice and even the guitar's initial capability. It becomes something that expresses the cultural context of the time. And what's interesting here is that misuse must align culturally. It can serve as a commentary, it can serve as a critique, but it's always situational. It's always location specific. So what's innovative misuse in one context is cultural blasphemy in another. So thinking about how misuse is a commentary on our societies, on our cultures, on our environmental conditions is really key. So I want to give you some methods for creative misuse. If you want to take this practice and incorporate it to become more creative, to find ways of using this within your work, I want to give you 4 techniques, 4 practices that you can employ when it comes to using creative misuse within your own work. The first is called actor network maps. And here I have people write down every single noun, a person, place, thing that's related to your work, to your project, to your research, to the thing that you're doing. Write it all down. Usually we use Post-it notes for this. You can use a chalkboard or a whiteboard. And then begin to build a network out of this. Map the network of relationships around these nouns. What's at the center? What's putting the most pressure on this system? What exerts the most pressure on other nouns? What's marginalized within this actor network map? How are these combinations of things working together? And what happens if then you take the thing at the margins and put it at the center rather than the thing that's currently at the center? Moving from that, we look at glitch studies, which is a bit of an environmental scan where you chart use and misuse and ask, what are the unintended consequences of how people are using my technology wrong? We usually want to get rid of these glitches. We want to get rid of misuse when it comes to our designs. But here it becomes this fantastic window into understanding how people interact with the world and interact with it wrong, and use these as a useful tool rather than something that needs to be eliminated. The most useful interfaces are adaptable, flexible, and resilient. And this glitch studies approach to this embraces that. We then move into what's called hybrid forms, thinking about ways of marrying objects and methods and fields of study in ways that they were never intended to be. This is a picture of artist Krzysztof Wodiczko's work, where he's working with urban designers and architects, and he's a projection artist, and he's creating projection design that is a commentary on homelessness within the city. So how do you marry something like urban design, architecture, and theater, for example, or projection art? Bring fields together that weren't in conversation before. What's a result of that? And one way to get at that question is the final thing, which is called mismatching nouns, where another term for this is bricolage, putting together things that never were to fit. So with my students, we write down tools, audiences, fields of study, some of those nouns that we initially developed in the actor network map. We put them on these little whiteboard dice, and then we roll the dice. And then we say, here's what you have to design. You put in these wildly different things next to each other, what emerges? And it's a way of prompting people to begin to think outside of the obvious. And this is the heart of innovation, taking that which already exists and pulling it so far beyond its original context that it's unfamiliar. So the best tools are adaptable, they're resilient, and we have to design with this resilience as a fundamental value. So Creative Misuse is a book that I'm currently working on, where I'm pairing these methods with these histories, where people have done it with the past, so we can learn from these examples of the past. And I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Jason. I want to just point out that there's lots and lots of discussion in the Discord about this creative misuse. I think it was mind-boggling for a lot of people, and people have been crowdsourcing other examples. Yoel says here that penicillin was an example of creative misuse. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So you see this in the medical industry quite a bit, where they enter trying to approach a particular problem, and then what results is something completely unexpected, and that's where the company pivots. You see this with Rogaine, you see this with Viagra. You know, these initial tools, medicines that were intended for one use ultimately have something completely different. So yeah, I think the healthcare industry, pharmaceuticals you see this happening quite a bit, where they're on the lookout for misuses, because ultimately, how is this best used in the world is a key question.
Let me ask a follow-on from Yoel here. Maybe you want to ask it yourself, Yoel, because you're on. You can speak about.
Oh right, I'm still unmuted. Jason, I'm super interested in your choice of the STEM misuse instead of reuse or repurposing. So I feel like a rebellious tinge to that, and I like it. I was wondering what your motivation is.
Yeah, indeed. I think that's a really fantastic question. So why not reuse? Why is it misuse? And part of it is that rebellion, where you're asked to do something unexpected. I think with reuse, it is about taking something, you know, like if you think about recycling, if you think about reusing things in ways that sustain their life, misuse is often about using it in a way that was unanticipated, that people didn't quite see initially. And that's kind of the motivation behind here. Is part of this is about issues of visibility, right? When it comes to design, what do we see? What is invisible? Where are the guts of the things? Where are the tools? You know, a lot of the practice of design is veiled. It's opaque. It's not transparent. It's not something we see behind. And so we're often then reiterating what is visible. Misuse is about a way of seeing. It's about a way of getting us to see the world differently. So rather than reuse, which I think is often drawing on expected uses, perhaps, I think misuse is a method for seeing the world differently.
Excellent. I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Jason.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm going to switch over to our next speaker, Ping Wang, who's a professor in the College of Information Studies.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Ping Wang. I'm a faculty member at the University of Maryland's Information School and HCIL. Both our school and HCIL are hubs for innovations, as you have seen this morning so far. Our faculty and students are innovators, constantly pushing the frontiers of research and development. Accordingly, my research Accordingly, my research addresses the question, how do innovations happen? Well, let's take a moment right now to think about this question. First of all, what is an innovation? An innovation may be a new technology, new product or service. Then how does the innovation happen? Well, you just saw a way that innovation may happen through misuse. Some may say that innovations happen randomly. Smart people get lucky, then boom, an innovation pops up. While I don't deny that luck plays a role in innovations, it is important to recognize the more strategic and systematic ways to innovate. In a dominant, long-held view on innovation, basic research drives applied research, which in turn shapes development, production, and operations. More recently, this linear model has been reversed by those who emphasize that user demand is the ultimate source of innovation. In 2013, the founding director of HCIL, Professor Ben Schneiderman, wrote in The Atlantic that neither linear model is valid. Instead, he proposed that breakthrough discoveries and innovations often come from the interactions between basic and applied research embedded in large development projects. Professor Schneiderman's ecological model resembles a new way to innovate in the digital economy, which has been termed innovation ecosystems. An innovation ecosystem is a loosely coupled set of people and organizations involved in the creation and adoption of new technologies or products. For example, Apple's iPhone ecosystem consists of app developers, accessory makers, wireless carrier customers, and of course, Apple, in which they co-create or adopt innovative products and services made available via the iPhones. The participants of the ecosystem are loosely coupled because they are free to join and leave the ecosystem without losing their autonomy. And while in the ecosystem, they don't have to follow orders like employees in a traditional hierarchical company. Rather, their relationships mimic those among different species in a natural ecosystem. The iPhone ecosystem is just an example of the innovation ecosystem that generates new products or services. Other notable examples are Google Android ecosystem and Amazon's web service ecosystem. Actually, Amazon orchestrates multiple product ecosystem in e-commerce, cloud computing, food, and most recently entertainment. And this product ecosystem are integrated into Amazon's business ecosystem, in which not only new products and new services are introduced and adopted, but also new business models may be tested and implemented. Even more broadly, an entire technology and market category can form its own innovation ecosystem, like the personal computing ecosystem, person-computer ecosystem shown here, where waves of innovations emerge constantly. By now, ecosystems have become a very popular model to innovate. We can all feel the buzz of ecosystem. This chart shows the increasing numbers of articles about ecosystems in academic conferences. In industry, the Boston Consulting Group reports that companies that mention ecosystem in their annual reports tend to grow their revenues faster. Why are ecosystems so popular? Why are innovation ecosystems so popular? First, digital technologies have broken monolithic product architecture into pieces or modules that different parties can make and then integrate into a coherent package for the customers to buy. This digitally enabled division of labor and integration of efforts have made it possible to innovate in ecosystem. Further, it is also desirable to innovate in ecosystem because digital technologies are inexpensive and scalable. Moreover, sometimes it is even necessary to innovate in ecosystem due to Joy's law, as famously put by Sun Microsystems co-founder feel joy. Most of the bright people don't work for you, no matter who you are. So you need a strategy that allows for innovation occurring elsewhere. One such strategy is to tap the unlimited creativity that autonomous players bring to innovation ecosystems. So the possibility, desirability, and the necessity to innovate in ecosystem make this ecological model of innovation very, very popular. However, just because innovation ecosystems are popular does not mean they always thrive and succeed. In fact, the successful innovations that you're familiar, those successful innovation ecosystems that you're familiar with are exceptions rather than the norm. Most ecosystems struggle to even get started. Some achieve early momentum, but then collapse. What makes an innovation ecosystem collapse and fail? The more effectively digital technologies enable the division of labor, the more creative and resourceful parties will join an ecosystem, on the one hand, sustaining the ecosystem. But on the other hand, they also bring complexity, interdependency, and uncertainty to the ecosystem, which may cause the ecosystem to collapse and fail. So there's this paradox here. This paradox reminds us that ecosystem success depends on not only the division of labor, but also on the integration of everyone's efforts. So this integration requires that governance and control put in place. For example, the sponsor of the ecosystem may screen new entrants and regulate the innovation activities of the ecosystem participants. This integration of efforts also depends on the coordination among the actors in the ecosystem. For example, many innovation ecosystems have tools such as application programming interface and the software development kit to coordinate participants' innovation activities. The integration of efforts also depends on the decisions that ecosystem participants make. For example, whether to join or leave the ecosystem is an important decision for a company to make as it defines its own boundaries and ecosystem boundaries. All of these processes, control, coordination, decision-making require relevant information because actors in ecosystem need information to reduce the complexity, interdependency, and uncertainty. But on the other hand, ecosystem of different size and different structure may have different capacity for processing information. You must match ecosystem's information needs with its information capacity. Digital technologies serve a few key functions to satisfy information needs in the ecosystem. For example, ecosystems are largely invisible without physical presence. Nonetheless, the data about the ecosystem can be found from multiple sources, such as the trade press, scientific publications, patents, social media, etc. Visual analytic tools may be employed to help decision makers visualize the ecosystem. This diagram made with Node Excel shows that innovation ecosystem for customer relationship management, CRM, was a multimodal network in which different players playing different roles with different relationships among them. The dean of Babson College drew this network diagram to help visualize the market category ecosystem for mobile payments. Since each player can join multiple ecosystems, this category ecosystem is a multimodal, multiplex ecosystem network. HCI researchers at Georgia Tech developed a visual analytic tool to help visualize multimodal and multi-layer network of actors in one or more ecosystems. As Lucas and Barodi speculated nearly 30 years ago, the organization of the future may not be an organization at all. Please note that the future they were talking about is probably now. Ecosystems represent a new systematic way to organize innovations today. Innovation ecosystems need information to exist and thrive, HCI researchers and professionals can help develop the next generation information systems for ecosystems. I just used the visualization as an example here, but there are plenty of other great opportunities for HCI folks to help satisfy the information needs in ecosystem. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the National Science Foundation for the funding. Many thanks to Leilani and Tammy for their helpful feedback on my practice talk for this presentation. You can read the summary of this talk in the HCIL blog or request a full paper to read. Thank you.
Thank you, Ping. So we're short on time. There's a bunch of discussion in the Discord, so we can look at that. I had a question here, maybe that you can talk about, just a brief one.
Sure.
So in the early days of the Apple so you're talking about these ecosystems that are created by companies and other, creators can use. So in the early days of the Apple App Store, the App Store, I think, was on the first on the market before Android came along, and people were saying, that Apple has an unsurmountable lead, and no one will ever build apps and create such a big app library. But we know that this hasn't changed. So this has changed, and now we have Google Play and other apps ecosystems. So do you think, what are your thoughts on this? Is there a finite, how do these ecosystems compete, and how could that, what would happen in this particular case?
Oh, actually, I have a backup slide to show this.
This is not rehearsed,
but this is great. Not a planned question. So see, so there are different kinds of ecosystem at different levels. So we have product like iPhone, right? So Android, their product ecosystem. We have business ecosystem at a higher level, and then we have a market category ecosystem and technology category ecosystem. So at each level, the different ecosystem are competing with each other, but lower level ecosystem belong to higher level ecosystem, like Amazon is orchestrating many product ecosystems. So the competition is actually multi-level. So you can say that Apple's business ecosystem is competing with Google's business ecosystem. But at some point, at the lower levels, sometimes they can collaborate. So for example, Google Apps may be available in iPhone's network and vice versa. So there are different ways to compete and collaborate. The interesting thing about ecosystem is that when you're co-creating value, you're always collaborative. But when it comes to capture the value that has been co-created, it's always competitive. The current event, the lawsuit between Apple and Epic Games, the Fortnite, the owner of Fortnite Games, is an indication of this very competitive, conflicting value capturing process.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Ping. In the interest of time, we're going to move on. Some of you who have kept track of the time will note that we are behind. That's fine. It happens. I think that Jonathan's talk will be given as much time as everyone else. So we'll go a little into the lunch hour, and hopefully we can adjust that for Catherine and Ben's historical Chi videos. So anyway, I'm happy to introduce Jonathan Lazar, who's a professor in the iSchool, and we'll talk about his work.
All right. I want to say good morning to everyone, but it looks like that we are about a minute or two away from saying good afternoon, everyone. Slides are working. Sound is good? Yes? Great. I'm going to talk to you today about managing digital accessibility at universities during the pandemic. Now, we have had an ongoing problem with digital accessibility at universities, even before the pandemic. This has been an ongoing problem. All different types of campus technology, right, have had accessibility barriers for students, faculty, and staff with disabilities. And unfortunately, as you see with this cover article from Inside Higher Ed magazine, we've continued to have problems during the pandemic. And in many cases, it's gotten worse because now everything is online. And so the number of accessibility barriers for students, faculty, and staff has really increased. Interestingly enough, I was already going to do a study during the year 2020, and a study funded by the Google Faculty Research Grant, so thank you, Google, looking at how universities manage digital accessibility throughout a calendar year and the changes that occur and what are some best practices. So in January 2020, I already started doing interviews for this study, and I was doing interviews throughout the year, approximately every 2 months, with directors of digital accessibility at a small size university, a medium sized university, a large size university, and also a comparative state government. Now, because these interviews were already occurring in January 2020, pre-pandemic, this gave me an interesting front seat at watching how did universities manage digital accessibility during the pandemic. So just because of the lack of time, I'm not going to talk about all 4 individuals that I interviewed. I'm only going to talk about the small size university and the large size university, but there's a paper and a video that you can actually read or watch that give you the full results. So, and I'm using nicknames, pseudonyms for the people who I interviewed. So we're going to talk first about Marshall at the small sized university. And let's talk about Marshall. So Marshall is the director of digital accessibility at the small sized university, but that's not his full-time job, right? His full-time job is a whole series of other things. Accessibility is only a part of it. Now, Marshall was telling me that pre-COVID, right, they had just updated the homepage of the university to be more accessible. And their goal was that they wanted to roll out the accessibility improvements to other parts of their website. The goal in 2020 was also to reduce the number of PDF files on campus, because as we know, PDF files are often harder to make accessible than other digital formats. They hoped in 2020 that they were going to be able to educate content editors about accessibility, start some training. Marshall had noted that they have very few students with visual or hearing impairments. They said they tend at their university to have more students with learning disabilities, but that they got almost no complaints or negative feedback about accessibility. Said no one gives us feedback. And the problem is everyone in the university wants to own their piece of it and say, we make things accessible, but no one actually wants to fund it. So this is sort of like a before and after. So that's what Marshall was talking about at the beginning of 2020. What actually happened? Well, at the small size university, Marshall described that he was struggling to keep up. Every time that he felt things might be going back to normal, the rug was pulled out from under me and there were changes again. Marshall talked about problems with procurement, right? That as much as normally Marshall and the people that he worked with would track procurement for accessibility, he said during the pandemic, right, they were just completely bypassed on procurement. So tons of technologies, everything from software for online testing, software for tracking and displaying COVID data, planned giving, that all this software, all these tools were acquired, even though they weren't accessible. Now, from the beginning of the pandemic, Marshall said that they used live captioning, right, where they had a professional human captioner for campus-wide events, and that worked well, but that they used auto captioning in Zoom for classes, and that didn't work well. And later in the year, they finally had to decide, okay, we're going to switch and hire human captioners. Marshall was not able to roll out any type of training related to digital accessibility, right? And also, he said, actually, the goal had been to reduce the number of PDF files on campus, right? But actually, in 2020, he said the situation with PDF accessibility got worse. Not only were they not able to reduce the number of PDF files, but also, right, a lot of offices, since students wouldn't be stopping by to fill out a form, they just took their forms, right, scanned them in an inaccessible way, put them on a flatbed scanner, and said, here's a graphic PDF, fill this out. So he said, actually, by the end of 2020, the accessibility problem for PDF files on campus, it was actually worse. So that's the story of Marshall. Now, as a comparison, we're going to talk about Neil. And Neil is the director of digital accessibility on a large size university campus. Now, that's Neil's full-time job. His team is responsible for web accessibility, multimedia, including captioning, accessible learning, and procurement. And Neil talked at the beginning of 2020, kind of his plans for the year, that they already have a policy on web accessibility. They already have a policy on captioning, but they didn't have central funding to pay for it. And so we would require captioning, but there was no central funding. So each college or each academic unit was required to pay for it themselves. Neil had a really ambitious set of goals for 2020, creating accessible web page templates for the whole campus, putting out best practices in accessibility testing, in online learning, in social media, in live captioning, as well as, right, Neil was trying to make it so that when faculty applied for promotion and tenure, right, that they would actually be required to document how they made their course materials and their digital materials accessible. So it's a very ambitious year that, that Neil had planned. And so Neil talked at the beginning of 2020 about how actually the campus doesn't have a great infrastructure related to disability. So services that would normally be provided by essential disability student services, Neil said his office often got kind of spillover requests, right? That the central office wasn't doing a good job. So they would come to Neil and his team because they knew Neil was really great at making things happen. So what actually happened in 2020 at the large size university? What actually happened is that the central administration had added new staff positions and funding, but Neil was required to step away from some of his accessibility work in general to help create COVID websites. So Neil was a little bit distracted by other work being given to him. At the beginning, Neil described focusing on the accessibility of the 25 most visited websites on campus. Neil mentioned the increased requests for captioning videos and for online training. Neil mentioned it worked really well. The provost put out small grant awards to faculty for reworking their classes for an online format, and most of the faculty actually included accessibility in the reworks. That's great. Neil described problems with captioning and saying a lot of the campus units said, well, we have automated captioning. That's fine. We don't need human captioning. That costs more, right? So he said that was really a problem, and that Neil still had not been able to get half the campus units to have an IT accessibility plan, right? And even during the pandemic, 2 colleges were still pushing back on making these things accessible. So you see some similarities and some differences between a small and a large size university during the pandemic. But what were some common challenges with the 3 universities and the state government? So everyone that I interviewed, what were some common challenges? Procurement. Procurement was a common challenge. Every single interviewee talked about this, that basically emergency or fast track procurement power was given to the people who procure technology that bypassed all the accessibility checks. So there were all of them that I interviewed said that there were tons of inaccessible technologies procured. One of my interviewees said, we're going to be reaping the rotten effects of those contracts signed without accessibility for years to come. We're going to be stuck with all these inaccessible technologies. And one of the people I interviewed described that they had someone on their campus who said, you know, accessibility is one of many procurement checks that I'm bypassing because I need to get that online lab software installed right now, today. And so, you know, they said that, yeah, they bypassed not only accessibility, they bypassed security. Basically, people said, I don't have to do any procurement checks anymore. So procurement was a common challenge. Another common challenge was captioning. There was a large increase in demand for both videos and also for live events, right? Again, you had, as Neil mentioned, campus units pushed to say, well, I can just turn on the automated captioning feature. That's fine, we're set. And it's like, no, not the same quality as human captioning. You know, some of the universities prioritize public content. So they said, well, we'll make our public content accessible since we don't know who will be accessing it, but behind a single sign-on, right, behind an authentication wall at the university, we'll only make that content accessible and only do captioning there upon request, which is not really a best practice. There was such a high demand to get professional captioning as well as live captioning, and funding was an issue. So really, captioning, there were a lot of people who wanted to do captioning, but they didn't always want to either pay for it or they had trouble getting the human captioners to do it. PDF accessibility, that was also a problem because the campuses and the state agency all mentioned, even though I didn't ask them originally about PDF accessibility, that wasn't on my list of questions, right? They all talked about how PDF accessibility was a problem. And so Marshall mentioned how he thought that the level of PDF accessibility had actually gotten worse during the year. And so some of the strategies they used were try and reduce the number of PDF files used in the organization, right? Providing training, so a lot of training was provided for content creators, and also purchasing standalone software tools for PDF remediation. So kind of what are your takeaway messages? What are suggestions for managing digital accessibility that come out of my interviews and my research during the pandemic? So first of all, you have to make sure that accessibility requirements remain in procurement, because this emergency procurement authority, that just means bypass everything related to accessibility. You want to limit that as much as possible and eliminate it as well. It was important to provide online training to people, right? Faculty, staff, students, anyone involved in creating content. You need to provide a lot of online training. And generally, there were increases in the number of people signing up during the summer semester breaks and the winter semester breaks. So that's, prepare for a lot of demand then. Grants or incentives to faculty and staff to learn the core digital accessibility concepts, that seemed to be really effective. Even small incentives. But you want to not just have the core digital accessibility team, you also want to have people who aren't experts in accessibility. They need to become, right, your people who care about accessibility and are knowledgeable. Two more takeaways. First of all, you have to plan ahead, right, to have capacity on demand related to accessibility. All of these things such as captioning, right, sign language interpretation, especially when switching back and forth between in-person and partially virtual and full virtual format. There was no one had planned ahead for this. No one had planned ahead for a surge in demand. And interestingly enough, no one changed any policies during the year. Throughout this year of so many ups and downs, there were no new policies added at any of the places where I had interviewed people, right? About how do you deal with the need for additional budgetary resources? How do you deal with when you have a lack of human captioners available? How do you deal with staff being reassigned, which happened at one university, right? So there was really no policy put in place to manage this. It was all on the fly. And that was really a problem. Hopefully we are nearing the end of the COVID pandemic, hopefully, but one could imagine that there could be many surges in digital accessibility demand, right? Not only in a pandemic, because hopefully the pandemic is getting close to ending, and hopefully we won't have another one, but this need to plan for a surge in digital accessibility needs, there are a lot of reasons why we could have a surge. For instance, climate change, right? We may have campuses that are near the water where students have to suddenly move to other campuses due to flooding. That happened, for instance, during Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, where students at New Orleans universities had to move to other universities. You can imagine changes due to political unrest, where you suddenly get students leaving from a certain area because there's a lot of political unrest, and there's a surge in new students at universities, right, in a neighboring state or a neighboring country. You could even imagine funding changes. For instance, as the UK left the EU, suddenly all these EU students, right, they couldn't use their funding to go to UK universities. So they were returning back to their home countries. So you could easily imagine many other reasons why we'd have a surge in demand for digital accessibility. But no one's planned for that. About a week or two ago, there was a great interview with the CEO of Gojo Industries, right? Gojo Industries makes Purell. And in the interview, she talked about how they hadn't been planning before for surges. She said, but we are committed to being surge ready. I love that quote because I thought that's what we need to do in terms of managing digital accessibility. At universities and at government agencies, we need to plan to be surge ready. We need to plan ahead to make sure that when suddenly there's a great leap in demand for digital accessibility, we need to have plans in place, we need to have policies in place so that we are ready to meet that need and ensure that everyone has an equitable and accessible experience. I want to encourage you to reach out to me at jlazar@umd.edu with any questions. Also note that the full paper has already been published. So this is obviously a shortened version of the research. The full paper has been published. It's available open access. in the journal Universal Access in the Information Society. I believe Pramod has already put in the chat a link to the paper. Also, there's a 45-minute version of this talk on the Google Tech Talk channel. So thank you again to Google for sponsoring this research. And the actual link, this is the link to the Google Tech Talks, but Pramod has also put in the chat the link to the final presentation. So thank you, everyone. I look forward to your questions. My guess is we probably don't have much time for questions since we're running late. So I will leave that to Niklas, but I encourage you to reach out to me with any questions as well. Thank you. And thank you for being here today to celebrate, right, so many great years of human-computer interaction research at the HCIL. Thank you so much.